Thanks, Larry. Well, it looks like the next speaker is me. Oh, boy. And I have the unenviable position of being between you and lunch. But the good thing about going last is that often people have already said what you're planning to say before you get up here. So I'm going to make this quick to make sure we have time for a few questions. Hopefully. You've heard a lot, just from the public perspective. There's been a whole lot going on in the past couple of years. I already mentioned that there's been all kinds of congressional involvement and oversight. Just this past December, Congress actually finally, after 2 years of dithering, passed a bill that they called the Pipeline Safety Regulatory Certainty and Job Creation Act. They like to throw every little catchphrase that they think will win them a vote possible into such things. But that was good, and it moved a lot forward, and you've already heard about some of those things. The things that we think the act really did help move forward was it did expand integrity management, or started to move that expansion forward, just as Larry was talking about. You know, he was talking about right now they're only required to do integrity management in high consequence areas. Well, the high consequence areas for those big gas transmission pipelines are only 6 or 7% of all the miles of pipelines in the whole country. So this act will start pushing that forward, and the industry's even ahead of that more by already committing to, you know, going 100% on that in some ways or another. It increases fines. It starts to move forward in automated shutoff valves, so we don't have the same problem that we saw in San Bruno. It increases transparency. One of the Pipeline Safety Trust's big issues is to make sure that the public and local governments can look at enough information that they can verify whether the industry and the regulators are doing the right thing. This starts doing that. Previous to this bill being passed, local governments couldn't even find out what was considered a high consequence area. So if you wanted to know which rules applied where, you couldn't find that out. This opens that up and will make it available to the public, along with some information about spill response planning and some of the standards that get incorporated into the laws. Moves forward on leak detection. There's the study about oil sands that Chris mentioned already. In a huge issue in parts of the country that's one of our highest priorities is gathering lines, and it doesn't affect Utah much, at least not yet, but in places like Texas and Pennsylvania, there's tens of thousands of miles of new pipelines going into the ground to gather new fuels out of the ground, and a lot of these gathering lines in rural areas are the same size and pressure as other big transmission lines, and they're totally unregulated at this point. That starts moving some of that forward. And it also deals with the grandfathered clause that Chris talked about, and it makes companies confirm that they really know what is a safe pressure to operate their pipelines at. I think Chris covered pretty well what some of the major federal rulemakings are already on. I think we've seen major lists of that. States are starting to ramp up some of their pipeline safety rules too. Some of it's in response to the stuff PHMSA is doing, pushing them to have better damage prevention laws. So you're seeing states starting to change some of those laws. States like California are certainly responding to the tragedy that happened there, and they're whole hog going to rearrange the laws of how gas pipelines are regulated in California. And then you see new pipelines like we talked about already, and I showed the films, both the gathering lines and pipelines like Keystone. NTSB came out with a whole series of recommendations. They're kind of, the major ones are listed here, and they were pointed at everybody. There was things that the industry needs to do better. They pointed at the Secretary of Transportation and said he needs to do an audit of his own departments to make sure they're doing what they ought to, and there was a lot pointed at both the state and federal regulators about things they need to do. I think, as I mentioned and I showed the film clips, we've had unprecedented press coverage in the last 2 years. So all of a sudden the reporters are called. I got an email this morning from the New York Times. What should I be reporting about this week? So somebody in the audience tell me what we should get the New York Times to talk about this week. At one point right after San Bruno, I spent probably 3 months doing nothing but talking to reporters, and we were quoted in 2,400 newspapers in the course of 90 days or something. Pipelines Informed Planning Alliance, there's a whole session about this tomorrow. It's one of the most important things I think local government can do, and the pictures kind of show what that is. The picture on the left was what an area near where I lived, looked like in 1990, and then 12 years later, homes built all around a very large pipeline. So we're going to talk about how Salt Lake City and Salt Lake County may be able to deal with that. And there's other ways to involve the public more. PHMSA has stepped up in the last 10 years and made grants available. This forum today is being paid for by one of these technical assistance grants from PHMSA. So local governments and citizens groups can get up to $50,000 a year to kind of do their own investigations of pipelines and their own education so they can try to confirm what's going on. And transparency has got really good. It was hard to find out where pipelines were or what anybody was doing with any of them when Bellingham happened 13 years ago. The PHMSA website now gives you so much information. The problem is trying to figure out how to use it all and what to do with it. But you can find out enforcement records, inspection records, all the incident records there. Now we're starting to push the states to make sure that they're making some of that information available also. And finally, there's just more and more opportunities to increase public involvement in pipeline safety. We've been trying to work hard on those types of things. You heard some mention, like we do a national conference each year, which is the one picture up here on the right-hand side, and it's been in New Orleans just about every year because my board president likes New Orleans, so that's where we go. And we bring, I think this year we had 160 people there from all the different legs of the stool talking about pipeline safety. Before that conference, we worked with some of the liquid industry, and we brought a whole bunch of people and took a tour of a bunch of the big facilities that occur in Louisiana. And they were activists from all over the country, got to tour that and ask questions of the people that operate that stuff, and I think it improved everybody's understanding of those things. So there's lots of opportunities like that and opportunities like going on today, and hopefully we can enlist some of you and make some of those go forward in the past. I think that's all I had to say. We'd be glad to take a few questions.